Hi, welcome to Code to Scale. Today I have something very interesting to discuss. So I was going through this technical blog I just started, and I thought, why not kind of go through it together and understand how an architecture would look like of a settlement accounting system. So just to give you a little context, this accounting system is responsible for reconciliation flows, figuring out if there is fraud or not, figuring out that the payouts happen to users and consumers and merchants in a correct manner. Essentially, it's kind of can be considered as the backbone of an accounting system, a settlement accounting system, right? And probably if we go through this article, we will have an understanding of how a high level architecture of such a system may look like, because of course the designing systems are subjective, and it's also subject to trial and error, performance benchmarking, all of those good stuff, those good things. So yeah, thought of going through this blog and sharing insights, learning on the way, and all of these things. So without further ado, let's get started. So this essentially, the context of this blog I think is written with keeping fintech in mind and keeping settlements, refunds, chargebacks related to PSPs. What are PSPs? PSPs are nothing but payment service providers, right? These essentially are the entities which sit between merchants and consumers, and they are responsible for ensuring that your transfer of funds happen securely and smoothly. That's all, nothing like major there. Now, settlements in this context, so this I think is important. Settlements in this context refer to end of day process where funds collected from consumers. So consumers in the context of Uber may be riders, right? They are dispersed correctly to merchants. Merchant in this case would be Uber, minus of course any fee or charges, right? This makes sense. So let me just zoom in here. So this is typically what a cycle of payment looks like. You have your consumer, which is the rider. He from his account, so this is economics for $10 US transaction. So here the assumption is the uh, consumer is debited has debited $10 from his account, and those $10 after whatever fees, processing fees, scheme fees, and interchange fee, whatever is mentioned here, after that is subtracted, what is credited to the merchant, which is Uber in this case, right? So also interesting thing to note here, there is a gateway here, and Uber famously have designed their own edge gateway. I'm not sure if this is the actual one that is being used here, but I think the use cases would be load balancing and then compliance, security, all the good stuff, right? So probably in some other technical blog deep dive, I'll cover that, and it's gonna be interesting. So let's get started. So like, I think Uber here, the blog has given an insight into how many settlements per month they do, and what is the capital that they handle in cash in like in terms of annually, right? So what they've mentioned is 130 billion in cash in transit annually from over 50 different payment service providers, which is amazing, right? Like that scale is going to be crazy. And if you're getting a chance to work on such a scale, I think you're probably very lucky and talented. So yeah, so Uber processes about 1.2 billion settlements each month and 130 billion in cash in transit, which is an annual figure from over 50 different PSPs, right? Now, this process, whatever it is, it ensures that funds received from various payment methods are accurately accounted for and matched with the corresponding bank statements, right? And yeah, this is pretty much it. Now let's understand what the motivation is. So PSP files include, so I think this blog could have been written in a better way, where they would have given insights into PSP files first, where they tell you that okay, these are payment service providers files which contain information about the authenticity, the validation, the the transaction details, all the good stuff, right? But I think that is not done, and I think the motivation here probably doesn't even tell why this is required. I think the preface was nice, but then yeah, this is lacking. It's just a personal opinion. So what it says here is PSP files include various elements from payment service providers, each initiated by different parties, of course, and crucial for maintaining accurate financial operations. So we built the settlement accounting system to manage these events. But why? Like that thing is missing. So anyways, cool. So what are these events? So primarily there are three types of events: Uber initiated events, rider initiated events, and PSP initiated events. So Uber initiated event contains collections and refunds. So Uber initiates the collection of funds from riders for services rendered. Makes sense. Refunds whenever there is a dispute. Makes sense, right? Now, rider initiated events is just chargeback. So riders can, of course, dispute the transaction and question its legitimacy, and that whatever was the transaction, if the dispute has been successfully investigated and kind of considered as positive, then the transaction would be reversed, right? Moving on to PSP initiated events, these are payment service provider initiated events. So these would typically include fees, taxes, and then verification details. So this involves the authenticity and validity of the payments, and then PSPs on their end, they perform checks to prevent fraud and ensure that the payment details are correct, and the funds are actually available. So yeah, this makes sense, I think. Just like a tidbit here where they could have explained what PSP files are, and yeah. Cool. Anyways, so moving on, challenges with the PSP file. So I think if it's not clear, I'll kind of give a little bit of context. So payment service providers, how they communicate with Uber's payment service, internal payment services, they give details of transactions, authenticity, validation, funds in term like via PSP files, and these files can be received either via API, via an SFTP server, or via a blob storage, right, like S3 or something. So that is what PSP files are. It contains transaction details, and there is something called as transaction ID or transaction reference, which is a unique deterministic identifier that, okay, this is the transaction and this is its reference ID or ID, right? It's kind of like a, if I must say, a foreign key of sorts in relational databases. So anyways, let's see what are the challenges which Uber faces, or which any fintech actually faces with these PSP files, right? I think I've also worked with a lot of these fintech PSPs, and these challenges are like widely known. There is no essential common file format, which of course increases the complexity. You will often get duplicates, which will lead you to develop a deduplication layer at your end, right? And so what can this lead to? This can lead to inflated payouts. So assume that your transaction for a payment of $100 is recorded twice. What happens? Instead of paying $100, you're paying now 200, which is, business gets affected, and if business gets affected, it is bad for the engineering as well, right? So missing or wrong references, this challenge involves the absence of necessary reference ID. So a transaction record might lack a unique transaction ID. So essentially, if you, from a PSP provider, right, a payment service provider, if you get a transaction, but it does not have a transaction reference or transaction ID, you can't map it in your backend services to say that, okay, this transaction was recorded at our end and this is what PSP gave. If PSP itself is giving you a record with no transaction ID, you cannot even map it, and reconciliation will get affected, your payouts will get affected, a lot of bad things happen, right? So yeah. Now, format issues, the data that is coming from different PSPs can be in different formats. So you essentially have to have normalization layer at your end, which is ensuring that, not a normalization layer, but rather a parser layer, which ensures that you are parsing your data from n number of different formats into a common format, which is the language spoken by all of your microservices in the backend, right? Cool. Balancing equation is not satisfied. So balancing equation, I think, is nothing but settlements minus deduction, and that is equal to your payout. Now what happens? Let's say you have $10,000 of settlements and 2,000 of deductions. So payout should be what? 8,000. But if the PSP file shows 7.5 thousand, then there is a discrepancy which needs investigation, right? And a large one of transaction monitoring. So assume that one transaction of $10 million has been made. Now how do your systems ensure that the monitoring of this transaction happens very closely and ensures that the transaction is successful? Because it's a large one of transaction and you cannot have any failures, and if the failures are there, then you must correctly identify what was the cause and how to reconcile. I hope this kind of makes sense. I think fairly basic stuff until now. Now let's jump into the architecture. So from what I can understand, there are three services. Before kind of jumping into the blog, and like I like to make assumptions and then kind of see if those assumptions hold true or not. Maybe a bad habit. Anyways, so I think three services: feed ingestion, feed processor, and reconciliation and accounting service. And as I said, right, SFTP API or a cloud bucket will provide you the settlement files, and then your feed ingestion will be responsible for some sort of parsing, normalization, tokenization, all that. And then it'll give the normalized settlement file to feed processor, and that will kind of transfer it to reconciliation and accounting service for whatever accounting logic needs to be applied to the normalized the processed data. And of course you store it in accounting ledger for data purposes. Anyways, Now let's go through the actual text part of it. Settlement accounting system manages challenges with PSP files and streamlines the financial precision. Settlement accounting at Uber has three primary components: the feed ingestion service, feed processor, and reconciliation that we know. Now, the file ingestion service is integral to managing settlement files obtained from third-party PSPs. Its primary function includes fetching these files from third-party sources and transferring them to a designated file storage location. This approach ensures that we avoid excessive retries or reprocessing requests from third-party sources by storing files internally. Understood. So the idea here is if you if you're retrying or reprocessing, you don't have to call the third-party service again. You already have the raw settlement files that the PSP has provided. So let's take a look at the architecture of file ingestion service at Uber. From the diagram, it is clear that the first process is after a cron scheduler will run, and it will call the downloader module, and downloader module is going to download the PSP files from either the SFTP server or API or a blob storage. Now, once the file has been successfully downloaded, the raw file is stored in the blob store. After that, what happens is the cron scheduler will call the parser layer. Now, one interesting thing that I was wondering, so by applying the parser rules, what Uber does is they stage the files into necessary tokens for further processing. So why is tokenization important here? So whatever data was provided by the PSP files, right, before parsing it, you tokenize it to get necessary information outside of, you extract the necessary information from the PSP file. Once you have extracted the necessary information from the PSP file, now the parser can check that, okay, is the format correct? If the format is not correct, it can parse it into a correct one. It can check for essential keys, all the good stuff, So this is what tokenization before parsing implies, and why it is important. Before you provide any kind of data for your parser to parse, you should ensure that relevant keys, relevant things are present, and they are tokenized, of course, right? So I hope this is, I think, straightforward as well. Now, tokenization involves splitting using delimiters and tagging the data. I think this tokenization rule probably is like a very extensive thing because they have a lot of PSPs. So I'm assuming that this is very dynamic. Okay, yeah. So this, of course, they've mentioned this as well, right? So this necessitates the dynamic parsing tailored to each format at PSP and PSP. The file ingestion service relies heavily on configuration for parsing the files sent by the PSP. For every PSP onboarding into the system, parser rules are written. Oh, interesting. Okay. So what happens is your tokenization and so parser rules, I think I'm assuming they are separate for separate PSPs, and then tokenization gives the necessary data to the parser, and parser is responsible for checking whatever are the necessary keys, whatever formatting needs to be maintained, all the good stuff. So essentially, for example, what they've mentioned is let's say if the date format is incorrect in the tokenized data, so what the parser will do, it'll correct the date, it will transform the date format into whatever is being used as a norm in the backend services, right? Okay. So since PSP send data in their unique format, it complicates the process of data processing. Okay. To address the challenge, the file ingestion service performs crucial function known as normalization. Now, what does normalization do? So during parsing, the service converts the varied data formats received from PSP into standardized. That is what we talked about, right? Parser is responsible for keeping the formats consistent. What does normalization do? So normalization process ensures that data is structured consistently, facilitating easier and more efficient processing downstream. So I think, yeah, this kind of makes sense. Now, to effectively process the PSP feed, essential fields like amount, currency, transaction date are identified as critical. These key business data elements are extracted and structured into a standardized, normalized format known as PSP events. Okay, so what is happening is after your normalizer has produced a normalized thing, a PSP event is produced to maybe your Kafka stream, and the same normalized file is stored in a blob store for maybe you would want to use it separately. So one common thing which I've noticed is at every step, if let's say that layer is responsible for transforming the file how it looked before transforming in the file, how it looks after transforming, both of these data points are stored, which I think is like a testament to however like rigorous compliance and like not security, but like compliance. I think any and every kind of data before processing and after processing has to be stored. which is extremely interesting, and I think a norm in fintech nowadays. So, anyways, moving on to the feed processor service. So, as summarized previously, the feed parser divides the incoming PSP files into distinct buckets called splits. Okay, this actually makes sense because this PSP event can contain a lot of contextually, like a lot of different contexts. So let's say, now if the PSP events has the validation information, authentication information, as well as the transaction information, just for the sake of example, it has at least 3 to 4 contexts in a single event. Now there is tight coupling between these contexts and processing the entire, let's say if you just want to process the transaction context, you would have to fetch the entire data. So I think this actually makes a lot of sense and is like probably the right design choice here, where whatever incoming PSP file data is coming, it breaks it down in context wise and stores it into buckets called splits. So there could be like a transaction split, there could be authentication and validation split, there could be tax split, fee split, whatever, right? So this makes sense. Okay, so this targeted segmentation ensures that each payment event is processed in a contextually relevant manner, setting the foundation for a more efficient and precise reconciliation. Interesting. Okay, so whatever your, what is this called? The file ingestion service has published to your Kafka stream, it is being consumed by your feed processor service and then contextually divided and stored into the blob store, and then the aggregation. So it is stored into your blob store after contextual segregation, and then the aggregate also is stored. So see, this is like a common theme in all of these services. How data looks before, how data looks after processing, both are stored, which is like I think it's a nice thing to have. And I think I'm guessing this number 4 step, which is calling the API, is the next service in line, which is reconciliation and accounting surface. Anyways, we'll move on to that later. So yeah, let's go through the text for this feed processor service. So following the parsing phase, the feed processor steps in to handle each of these buckets in parallel. Oh, that is also nice because you have contextually segregated your data. You can now parallelly process the tax aspects, the fee aspects, the transaction, the validation aspect, all these things, which is like a very efficient thing to do actually. Now, this parallel processing approach significantly accelerates the handling of large volumes of PSP events, reducing overall processing time and enhancing throughput. Now, for each PSP event within a split, the feed processor calls the reconciliation service. So yeah, this makes sense. This number 4 API call is to the reconciliation service. This service meticulously matches the PSP events with Uber's payment platform record. So yeah, this is the internal payment record that Uber maintains, and whatever PSP file the PSP provider has, sorry, not the PSP provider, the payment service provider has provided information in terms of PSP file, the reconciliation is done against that, which makes sense, of course. Now, what happens if reconciliation attempt is not successful? So if reconciliation attempt is unsuccessful, the system marks the event as unhealthy and submits to a dead letter queue, which can be, of course, taken a look at later and resolved at later time. So interesting. Okay. Now, once the financial services are enriched, they are sent back to the feed processor. After completing the processing of a split, these enriched financial events are forwarded to our accounting engine. At this stage, the financial events are meticulously processed and corresponding accounting transactions are persistently stored in our data repo. For anyone else to use, I'm assuming, for any other downstream dependency, they can directly refer to this. So interesting, makes sense. So moving on to reconciliation and accounting service, I think they've given the statistics that businesses typically lose around 5% of their annual revenue to fraud. So maybe they are emphasizing on the need for a reconciliation and accounting service at scale. So let's see. Besides protecting against fraud, effective payment reconciliation enables data-driven decision making, features the trends among various. Okay, so maybe they're running some analytics on this data as well, which is, of course, this makes sense, right? A company at such a scale has to understand what kind of business they are in with leveraging this analytics data. So yeah, without going into too much detail, I think, yeah, this also kind of makes sense. Okay. Now, the reconciliation service plays a crucial role in reconciling the PSP events with records on the Uber payment platform, ensuring that Uber receives payment for every trip where PSPs were involved in processing transaction. The reconciliation process hinges on matching precise records from both PSP and the Uber internal payments platform, right? So facilitated by a deterministic field transaction reference. So as we discussed earlier, right, there has to be a unique deterministic identifier, kind of a foreign key of sorts, if you want to draw an analogy to databases, relational databases. And this acts as a unique reference. So whatever is stored in the Uber payments platform and whatever the PSP is providing, we refer and we say that, okay, this is a match using the transaction reference or transaction ID. Now let's look at the architecture here. So what I see is a trip ingestion service. So whenever a trip event service generates an event of trip data, I think it could be a trip ID or transaction reference as mentioned here. It is passed on to a Kafka listener, and then trip ingestion processor loads the cache with trip ID and trip transaction reference. Basically, whatever the critical fields are for understanding how the trip went, whatever its corresponding transaction is, and all the other aspects of it. Now, what happens is in reconciliation service, your API is called by feed processor service and reconciliation begins. Now, okay, so this, I think what they've mentioned it is hydration, right? Data hydration. This is where they store the cache, as in the trip ingestion service stores the data in cache, and then reconciliation also checks data in cache against whatever data it is receiving in the API request. So this makes sense. Now, let's go through the text. Reconciliation operations aren't immediate upon trip completion, but can occur with a delay due to PSP sending data to Uber on a scheduled basis. So this makes sense. Yeah, okay. So typically daily or weekly, about T+7 days after transaction. Okay. So I think given the scale of transactions on Uber, T+7 kind of sounds about right. Now, given Uber processes about 1 billion trips per month via PSPs, the system must accommodate high scalability and robustness. Okay. To streamline operations and segregate responsibilities between trip ingestion and PSP event processing, we designed the system with dedicated trip ingestion service. And I think one thing that I really like is segregation of context and then microservices respecting that context. They understood that, okay, reconciliation and accounting service has to be a separate context, and then trip ingestion has to be a separate. But maybe something like a shared data pattern in microservices is used, as in like the cache, whatever is hydrated is referred to by the reconciliation thing, right? So yeah, this makes sense. Or maybe that is not the thing. I think, okay, this diagram probably could have been a little clearer, where whatever reconciliation is happening, so whatever PSP events this reconciliation accounting service is using, I think they should have mentioned that which data it is reconciling against. I think that's a little bit unclear here. Anyways, so to streamline operations and segregate responsibilities between trip ingestion and PSP, we designed system. Okay, trip information is ingested into the system via Apache Kafka. Consumer triggered on an event basis immediately upon trip completion. Kafka consumer hydrates the cache with essential details such as trip ID and transaction reference. This is what we talked about, enabling swift retrieval and correlation when processing PSP events. Now, when reconciliation is successful, the events undergo an enrichment process. They are supplemented with data from 15 upstream sources, okay, transforming them into comprehensive financial events. And these financial events are self-sufficient data models containing all the information necessary for precise and accurate accounting. Okay, so once the reconciliation has been successfully completed, I think data enrichment happens, where a lot of relevant metadata is added and then passed on to accounting service for it to apply its own accounting rules, right? And then the same thing is stored in a data store and passed on to a Kafka stream, where whoever wants to consume that data can consume it. So yeah, this actually kind of makes a lot of sense. Now, after accounting rules are evaluated for a given event, a transaction model is generated based on the outcomes, which I'm assuming is stored here. And the model represents the accounting treatment applied to the event. The transaction model undergoes a series of validation to ensure accuracy and compliance with accounting standards. Now, once validated, the transaction is saved in the data store and then, of course, pushed to Kafka topic for any downstream systems to consume. So this is exactly what they're talking about. So once the reconciliation happens, data is passed on to the accounting service, accounting rules are applied, then it outputs some sort of data. That data is stored in Cassandra for this instance, and then it's also published to the Kafka stream for any downstream services to consume that data. So I think, yeah, that's about it, probably. I think few pointers where they can make this blog better. One is motivation section, where they can actually say that, okay, a lot of these issues, I think a lot of these issues come later in the blog, just that I think, yeah, probably fine, maybe. And then one thing that I've noticed is a lot of these services, right, they're using a shared data pattern, which is like a very common thing in microservices. Usually when you read about microservices, you see one service, one data source, which acts as a source of truth and stores the state. But here, what I see, because of the nature of the use case, what they have used is a shared data access pattern, where one service is populating the data and other service is responsible for reading the data from it. So this is like this is pretty good actually. So I think, yeah, that's pretty much going to be it for this one. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.